The morning the mules came off the trailer, it was a Tuesday in the fall of 2009, and the sky was the color of old tin, flat and low, and holding a cold that hadn't decided yet whether to turn to rain. I stood at the end of my drive with my coffee going lukewarm in a chipped enamel cup, and I watched a rusted stock trailer come up the county road, slow its axle groaning over the washboard. The county never graded, and I want to be honest with you about something before I tell the rest of this, because if I don't own it now, the whole story reads like a woman who knew what she was doing. And I did not know a thing. I had $40 in cash folded in my coat pocket and a piece of ground that had been drying out for 3 years, and I bought 30 mules I could not afford to feed on a hunch I could not have put into words if you had asked me to. The man selling them had run out of hay and out of patience and out of whatever it is that keeps a person from letting animals go hungry. And the county had come out and told him to reduce or face charges, and so there they were, 30 of them, and he wanted them gone that day. I counted them through the slats while the trailer still rolled. I counted them twice. 30 head, and every one of them you could have hung your hat on the hip bones. He'd taken $40 for the lot, which came to $1.33 a mule, and he said it flat, the way a man says a thing he's already grieved, that they were headed to the killer buyer Thursday if I didn't take them, so I took them. I want you to understand, there was no wisdom in it. There was just the two of us. At a fence and a trailer full of ribs, and I signed a bill of sale on the hood of his truck with a pen that barely wrote. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story. And the version had grown, the way they do. By the time it got back to me a week later, I had apparently paid $400. Or I had traded a truck. Or I was running some kind of animal shelter for the tax break. None of which was true, but the truth of it. That I had paid $40 for 30 starving mules to put on 60 acres of dead pasture in the 3rd year of the worst drought anybody living could remember. That truth would have gotten me laughed out of the place faster than any of the lies. My neighbor to the east came by that same afternoon in a truck so clean it looked like it had never seen a field, which was about right, because he'd sold his cattle in the spring when the ponds went to cracked mud, and he'd been leasing his ground to a hunting outfit ever since. He leaned on the top rail and looked at my mules a long while, and he was not cruel. I'll say that for him. He never once was cruel. He just had the certainty of a man who'd done the math. He asked me what I planned to feed 30 mules on 60 acres that hadn't grown a decent blade since 2006, and I didn't have an answer, so I told him I was farming. He nodded like that settled it in his favor and drove on, and his tires were so clean they didn't even raise dust on my lane. Now here's the part I owe you, because you're going to want to know why a woman in her 60s who ought to have known better did a fool thing like that. It wasn't sentiment. I'll grant you it looked like sentiment, and it probably had a little in it. Nobody who watches 30 animals go by starved feels nothing, but that's not what moved my hand to my coat pocket. What moved it was a thing my grandfather told me when I was a girl of maybe 9, standing at this same fence line, though it was greener then, and there were mules on it then too. His mules, a big span of them he plowed and skidded logs with, because he never took to a tractor and never would. He said to me, and I can hear him yet, that a mule will find water a man will walk over for 50 years and never know is there. He said a horse is a fool about water, but a mule is not. That a mule won't drink bad and won't stand thirsty if there's a drop to be had within reach of its nose, and that if you ever want to know the truth of a piece of ground, you turn a mule loose on it and you watch where it goes. I was not. I filed it away the way children file the strange sure things old men say, and I never thought of it again for 50-some years, until I stood at that fence, with the drought pressing down on everything and a trailer full of the very animals he'd been talking about, and the thought came up out of the ground of me whole and finished. I had a hillside on the north end of that 60 acres that had never grown much and never held water and had a name in the family. We called it the Dry Shoulder, and my grandfather had cussed it, and my father had cussed it, and I had given up on it, and I thought, standing there, I will turn these out on the dry shoulder and I will see what they know. So I did. I ran them through the chute, one at a time, to look them over. And they were worse up close than through the slats. Wormy. Footsore. One old Jenny, with a wound on her withers gone proud, and I doctored what I could that first week out of what I had, and I fed them the little hay I could scrape together, and I fed them my own grocery money, more than once. And then I did the thing I am worst at in this world, which is wait, and I want to confess to you that I did not wait well. For the first 10 days those mules did nothing a person could point to. They grazed the poor grass down to the crown, they stood tail to the wind, they drank from the one stock tank I kept filled with hauled water because there wasn't a running drop on the whole place. And every day my neighbor's clean truck went by on the county road and slowed at my gate and went on. And every day I felt the $40 I hadn't been able to spare, and the hay money I really hadn't, and I told myself I had bought 30 starving mules for a story a dead man told a 9-year-old. And there were nights I believed it. It was the drought that made it all worse, and it's the drought you have to understand to feel the rest of it. So let me lay it on you plain. We were 3 years into it by that fall, and it wasn't the kind of drought that comes and breaks. It was the kind that settles in like a boarder who won't leave. The creek that ran the south line of my place, that had run every day of my life, had gone to a chain of still green pools by August of 2007, and by 2009 it was a dry bed you could walk down the middle of, the rocks bleached and the mussel shells gaping open where the water had left them. The county had gone to hauling for the little town, and there was talk, real talk, of the school closing and folks moving on. 2 big row crop operations on the good bottom ground east of me had put in wells that year, deep ones, and I heard the numbers at the co-op. One of them had gone 340 feet and hit water that came up tasting of iron and salt and had to be treated, and it had cost him better than $30,000 to do it, and the other had gone deeper and got less. The Dowsers were doing a business they hadn't done in 40 years. And into all of that, into a country where a man was spending $30,000 and 340 feet to chase water that came up half poison, I had turned out 30 mules on a hillside my own family had named for being dry, and I had done it on the strength of a sentence. I tell you all this so you'll know I understood how it looked. I understood it better than anybody, because I lay awake with it. On the 11th day, the old Jenny with the withers wound wandered up onto the dry shoulder alone, and I watched her from the porch with my grandfather's field glasses that don't focus right anymore, and she put her nose down in a fold of ground near the top, where 2 little draws come together, a place I'd bush-hogged 100 times and never thought about. And she stood there, that's all. She stood there with her nose down and her ears working, and after a while, 3 or 4 others drifted up and joined her. And by evening near, half the herd was up on that shoulder, standing in a loose cluster in that one fold, not grazing, not moving on, just standing where the poorest grass on the whole place was. And I remember thinking that was the last thing a hungry animal ought to do, go stand on the worst feed and quit eating. But I remembered too what the old man said, that you turn a mule loose, and you watch where it goes, and they had gone there. They had all gone to the same 15 feet of ground on a hillside named for being dry, and they were standing on it like it was telling them something. I put the field glasses down, and I went back in the house, and I did not go up there. And this is the part where I have to tell you about the notebook, because I would not have known what I was looking at without it, and I nearly didn't find it in time. My grandfather kept ledgers. Everybody's grandfather kept ledgers, but his were a particular kind, marble black and white composition books, and he kept one every year of his working life and stacked them in a wooden crate in the tack room, and after he passed in 1974, nobody threw them out and nobody read them either. They just moved with the tack when the tack moved. And by 2009, they were in the loft of the equipment shed in that same crate under a piece of canvas, and the covers had gone soft at the corners, and the pencil had gone brown. I'd known they were up there my whole life. The way you know a thing is in a drawer you never open. And that night, after I watched those mules stand on the dry shoulder, something turned me toward that loft. I climbed up with a flashlight because there's no wire run to the shed, and I pulled the canvas off the crate, and I sat down on the floor of that loft in the cold, with the dust coming up gold in the light, and I started going backward through my grandfather's years. I want to slow down here because this is the heart of it, and I don't want to rush past it the way I rushed past everything else in my haste to feel like a fool. He wrote small and careful the way men wrote when paper, cost, and pencils weren't wasted. He put down the weather and the work, and what a thing cost and what it fetched, plain as a man breathing. Colt weaned. Sold the gray span. $40, more than they were worth to a man who didn't know them. Set the north fence. 3 days. Hands sore. And I read a winter and a spring and a summer of it, and I was near ready to climb back down because the light was going and my knees were done when I got into the book from 1931, and I found the line. It was up in the corner of a page from that August, and it was set off from the work by itself, and he'd gone over it twice with the pencil so the letters stood up dark, and around one word he'd drawn a little ring. And it said, "And I'll give it to you exactly. Mules keep working the top of the dry shoulder in the heat. Won't quit it. Dug at the seep till it filled." And under that ringed one word and a question mark he never answered. The word was muck. Muck with a question mark, like he'd smelled water in the ground and couldn't get down to it, and couldn't say for sure, and had left the wondering there in the corner of a page for whoever came after. And I sat in that loft in the dark with the flashlight going yellow, and I read it maybe 6 times. And I'll tell you the truth, I put the notebook back in the crate, and I pulled the canvas over it, and I climbed down because I was not ready. I was not ready to believe it, and I was not ready to be wrong about it, and I told myself I'd sleep and go up in the morning, which was just a way of not going up that night. Now here's where I stopped being a woman waiting and started being a woman looking. And it's the part I'm least ashamed of. In the morning I was out before 5 with a spade and a soil probe I'd had since I ran a garden. That mattered, and I went up onto the dry shoulder where the mules were already standing. And they'd done something in the night. They'd worked at that fold of ground with their hooves, the way horses will paw at a spot, only they'd worked it hard. And there was a low place there, now, maybe a foot down and the size of a wash tub, and the dirt in the bottom of it was dark. Not wet, you could see. Dark. Cool to the back of my hand. I ran the soil probe down and it went in easy for 18 inches, which it should not have on a hillside 3 years into a drought. It should have hit like driving into a brick. And I pulled the core and the bottom 2 inches of it were a gray-blue clay that smelled. And I know this word now, of iron and cold, of muck. And I stood up on that hillside with a plug of gray clay in my hand, and I started to shake, and it wasn't the cold. I dug that morning by hand, because I didn't trust it enough yet to bring iron to it, and I want you to sit in the slowness of it with me, because that's how it happened. I dug down through the dark dirt the mules had softened, and at about 2.5 feet the spade started to suck coming out, and at 3 feet the hole began to weep at the sides. Little threads of it, clear water beating up out of the clay and running down and pooling in the bottom faster than I could bail it with a coffee can. And I sat back on my heels on the dry shoulder in the 3rd year of the worst drought anybody could remember, with a hole 3 feet down that was filling with cold, clear water. And I laughed, and then I did the other thing. And there wasn't anybody up there but the mules to see me do it. They had crowded in close around me by then. And the old Jenny, with the bad withers, put her nose down to the water, and drank, and it was the first thing on that place in 3 years that they hadn't had to have hauled to them. I did not run to the phone. I want that on the record, because everything in me wanted to, and the woman I'd been at 9 would have. Instead, I did what the old man would have done. I watched it. I dug a proper basin, maybe 4 feet across, and I lined the lip with flat rock so the mules wouldn't cave it back in. And I sat up there most of that day and into the next with a stick, marked in inches, stood in the middle, and I watched the level. Because water in a hole in a drought doesn't mean anything until you know it holds. Any fool can find a wet spot. And a pool. What you need to know is whether it's a memory or a spring, whether it's the last of something draining out or the top of something coming up. So I marked it at dawn and I marked it at dusk, and I let the mules drink all they wanted, 30 head watering off it, and the second morning it was up a half-inch over the first, drawn down and refilled overnight with 30 mules on it. And the third morning it was up again, and I knew then, the way my grandfather knew and couldn't prove, that it wasn't a wet spot. It was a spring. It had been there before he named the shoulder dry, and before his father worked it, and before there were any of us here at all, running cold under a hillside that Drought couldn't reach because it never came from the sky in the first place. It came from somewhere deeper and older, and the whole time we'd been cussing that hill for being dry. The water had been right there under our feet, and the only creatures on the place who knew it were the ones I'd bought for $1.33 a head. I fenced the mules back off it, after that gave them their own trough downhill of it, because I didn't want 30 head standing in my spring. And I want to tell you about the day I finally did bring somebody up there, because it's the closest thing to a triumph I've got, and it wasn't loud at all. I called the man I'd known a long time, a driller and well man, who'd put down half the wells in that country and was near 70 himself, a slow talker who'd tell you what he didn't know as quick as what he did, and he came out on a gray afternoon in November, and I walked him up the dry shoulder without much explaining. And he stood at the basin a while with his hands in the pockets of a Carhartt coat gone soft with washing. And he looked at the water, and he looked at the little threads coming in at the sides. And he crouched down and put 2 fingers in it and tasted it off the back of his hand. And he was quiet a long time. Longer than was comfortable. And then he stood up and looked out over the country, over the dry creek and the row crop bottoms, where one man had spent $30,000 to hit water that tasted of salt, and he said one word, and the word was clean. Just that. Clean. And then, after a minute, like it cost him something to give it up, he said he'd been drilling 40 years, and he'd never once found a spring. By drilling, that a spring finds you, and that a good cold clean one that runs through a drought like this was worth more than any well he'd ever put down. I let him think I'd found it. He'd have believed a dowser before he'd have believed a mule. Most men would, and I didn't need him to believe it. I knew. The county extension agent came out too, a young fellow with a clipboard and a truck as clean as my neighbors, well-meaning as they come, and he tested the water, and he tested the flow, and he gave me a page of numbers I still have in a notebook. And the number that mattered was better than 2 gallons a minute, steady. Right through the driest fall, on record, which he told me, reading off his clipboard, was not possible for a hillside seep in these conditions, that seeps like that go dry first. And I let him tell me it wasn't possible, while it ran cold out of the ground at his feet. And I have found that the modern way of knowing a thing is to have a number that ends the conversation, and the old way is to stand there and let the water make a liar of the number, and I have come to trust the second way more. Now, I'll give you the vindication since you've waited for it as patient as I made you, and it's a small thing, but it was everything to me. It was near Christmas, and there'd finally come a little rain. Not enough to break it, but enough to green the creek bed, and my neighbor with the clean truck came up the lane and got out at my gate, and he'd heard, of course, everybody had heard, and he walked up onto the dry shoulder with me, and he stood and looked at that basin running clear in the cold. 30 mules fat now, or fatter, glossy through the shoulder and sound on their feet, watering off a trough below a spring that hadn't been on any map, and he was quiet the way honest men get quiet when the world's told them something they'd bet against. And he didn't apologize. We don't do that. And he didn't make a speech. He just looked at the water a long minute, and he said, "That's not a hill I'd have called wet." And I said, "No." And he said, "Well," and he put his hands in his pockets. And then he said, the thing that was as close to a concession as his kind ever comes. He said, "You might have known something the rest of us didn't." And I said, "I didn't, that the mules did." And he looked at me sideways to see if I was joking, and I wasn't, and he thought about it. And then he nodded once, slow, the way a man nods when he decides to file a thing away and think on it later, and he got in his clean truck and drove on, and I stood up there on the dry shoulder that wasn't dry, and I let him go. I ran those mules 4 more years. Sold some, kept the old Jenny till she died of nothing but age in a good pasture, buried her up on the shoulder near the spring she found, and I don't apologize for that either. The spring runs yet. It ran through 2 more dry summers, and it runs today, cold and clean, better than 2 gallons a minute, and I never spent $1 to find it past the 40 I gave for the animals that did. Which comes out, if you care to do the arithmetic the way my grandfather would have, to $1.33 a mule for the only reliable water on the place. And I call that the best trade a fool ever made, without meaning to. And I've thought a great deal in the years since about what it was I actually bought that Tuesday, because it wasn't 30 mules and it wasn't a spring. What I bought, though I didn't know it, was the chance to find out that my grandfather had been right and that he'd known it and hadn't been able to prove it, and had left the wondering for me in the corner of a page, 1 word and a question mark, patient as the water under the hill, waiting 78 years for somebody to be foolish enough, or desperate enough, or just plain grieved enough to turn the right animals loose on the right ground and go up in the morning to look. Here's the thing I've come to, and then I'll let you go. We spend so much in this life chasing the water we can see, drilling 300 feet after it, spending $30,000 in getting salt, when the whole time the thing we need is running cold and quiet, right under the ground we've named for being dry. And the only reason we don't find it is that we've stopped watching the creatures and the ground and the old dead men who knew how to watch. My grandfather told me a mule will find water, a man will walk over for 50 years, and he was wrong about one thing only. It was 50 years and then some, but the mule found it, and I only had to be still enough and patient enough and humble enough to follow where it stood. The difference between a lost cause and a gift, I've decided, is only whether you were paying attention. If you've got your own dry shoulder, some piece of ground or a person or an old idea that everybody's given up on and called worthless, some starving thing you took a chance on that the whole town laughed at, I'd truly like to hear about it down in the comments, because I believe there's more water under more hills than any of us know. And if this old story meant something to you, stay on with me a while, subscribe, and I'll tell you another. We move slow on here, but we get where we're going, same as the water.